Hey everyone, Caleb with the Antique Book Collective, and today I'm getting to you guys with a really important video, and that is how do you store antique books? Now, of course, this sounds like something that's really obvious. It's like, well, obviously, you put it on a shelf like this with the spine facing out, you gotta make sure you know what it is. That's what you do, right? Wrong. Big wrong. Do not do that. When you are storing antique books, you do not store them upright like this. When you store them in a shelf like this, yeah, you can see the cover. Yeah, it looks correct, but that's not the best thing for the book. The reason for that is with antique books in general, they tend to have, so the text block is what you call the paper inside. You have the cover and the text block. The text block, when you have a really antique book, it tends to like sag down until the paper down here is touching the shelf, so it's going to be at a weird angle. And that means, and it shows that it's putting a lot of stress on the spine, on the binding, all that sort of stuff. It's putting a lot of stress on the book, and it's actually harming the book when you store them upright like this. So what you do when you are buying and selling antique books, or you just have antique books that you store, is have a stack. I know it doesn't look beautiful on a shelf, but you need to have your books stacked like this. It's the only way that you can make sure that the binding is lasting a long time. That's why when you go to museums, you either see the book laying flat, or some books, depending on the book, you'll see it lying open. Personally, I do not recommend opening your book all the way, especially with the antique books, because a lot of them, like this one here, is leather. The leather on this book is actually in great condition. It's really soft still. It's really, you can feel like some moisture in it. So this leather's really good, but when you have really old books, sometimes the leather, like, it turns into like the most brittle thing ever, and it will crumble if you try to open the book all the way. So like, you'll have to, if you want to read it, you'll have to like read it with this much open. Like, I know it's not much, and this particular book, yeah, I can open a whole lot more, but personally I don't like doing that. I am a book reseller. I am an antique book reseller. I don't want to damage the books whatsoever. If someone wants to damage the book, that can be the buyer. That can be the person that buys the book. They can hurt it all they want. For me, I want to make sure it's in as beautiful of condition, as perfect of condition as I can when I'm selling them. So I don't like going through these books very often. So that's something that you definitely want to keep in mind. So I know this book right here isn't the best illustration for this, and I know my camera's not the best, but here is a better illustration of a book that has been stored sitting upright for far too long. So I know it's not going to show up very well, but here's some sticky notes to show flat. So if you guys look really close, you can see that the pages, they sway down in the bottom here. And if you were here, if you were able to like handle this book like me, you could see that the book, all the pages definitely have slanted downwards over the years because they were stored upright like this, like everyone thinks it's supposed to be. But this is, seriously guys, is not how you're supposed to store antique books. And a lot of antique book people will probably yell at you if you try storing them like this, because it does damage them in the long run. It makes them sag, and at the end of the day, it actually can cause the page text block to actually come loose from the cover, which I've seen hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of times over the years that I've been buying and selling antique books. And I know I'm young, so saying I've been doing it for years doesn't sound like much, but I've been buying and selling antique books as my like entire professional career. That is my very first business that I got into. It's been an interest of mine like my entire life. I've always loved antique stuff. I actually have a stack of antique newspapers from the 20s to the 40s. From my old house. We had them in the walls, so I kept all those because I love antique stuff. It's so interesting to me. But something that I had to look up when I was trying to keep all these books is, well, how do I store them? So when I stored the newspapers, it's a lot of the same of how I store my books. I store them flat. I make sure they stay dry. I personally have my newspapers in a sealed plastic container, and I only whip them out when I really need to. For me, the newspapers are really like crumbly and fragile, so I don't handle many of them very often. Some of them are a little more nice and paper-like and can actually bend, but a lot of them are very brittle and fragile. So that is definitely something you guys do want to consider when you have your antique books. Some of them will have a lot more brittle of paper or brittle of leather, as I mentioned before, than others. So that's just something you definitely want to think about. You don't want to handle stuff that's too fragile too often. So that said and done though, how dry are we talking about for storing the books? So do not store your books in too dry of an area. That's another tip that a lot of people will actually get wrong. So a lot of people are like, oh, well, if the book needs to be in a nice dry area, I'm going to put it in with a dehumidifier and a whole bunch of those dehumidifier like RV boxes that are moisture absorbers. I'm going to put in 100 of those. I'm going to get humidity down to 0. Do not do that. So remember those books I mentioned that had all the crumbling leather? So one of the reasons why leather crumbles is because of lack of humidity. And there is, of course, also you need to like treat your leather well, and you have to do different things to make sure it lasts. But an issue for leather is if the area is too dry, it'll get brittle. And something else is binding, the glues and whatnot they use in binding. If it gets too dry, that can break. The strings can break. All sorts of stuff does get ruined if the air is too dry. Believe it or not, wood even crumbles if the air is too dry. So what people recommend is to keep keep your books in a not quite fully dry area, but make sure that the humidity is not out of control. What I like to keep my humidity out at is like the lower end of what the EPA recommends for healthy living. I think it's EPA. Oh man, I can't remember who it was, but they recommend something like 35 to 55% is what you should keep your house at to make sure your house's air is safe to live in. So I like to keep on the lower end of that for my books, because books do not need moisture to stay great. Do not let your books get wet. It'll ruin your books. It'll warp the pages. It'll cause damage in the long run, and it'll attract all sorts of little bugs and critters that will damage your books further. So make sure your stuff isn't too wet, but not too dry either. I know it's sort of complicated to figure out what the exact thing you should be shooting for is, but sorry, that's sort of the issue. It's sort of hard to make sure antique books last forever. That's why you don't find a lot of antique books out there. People just can't store them properly all the time. So another thing that you want to make sure is when you're storing your antique books, or any book in general, is keep them away from sunlight. I know it looks pretty to have all your books lined up next to your window on a shelf and have them all showing off in the nice sunlight, but the issue is, let's see if I can find the right book for this. Here we go. I got a little stack of books here for this illustration. So I hope this shows up, but as you guys can see here, this book is green. But on the side, it doesn't look so green. So let me open up this cover to really show you guys. So as you can see here, the cover and the spine, they're not the same color anymore. And the reason is because this book was stored next to a window for far too long. It was exposed to all the sunlight for far too long. So as you guys, I'm sure, know, if you hang out in the sunlight way too long, yeah, you'll get a nice tan, but in the long run, you'll get skin cancer, you'll get wrinkles, all those sort of things, a lot more than if you were a little more careful with sunlight. So the same thing is with books. If you store them and if they're exposed to sunlight too long, they'll get discolored. The coloring of the text itself on the book's spine will get to the point that you can barely read it. So like, I'm here and it's hard to read this thing. So I am certain that it's not showing up on the camera, but I am sure that the color is showing. So sometimes the books, their spines get darker when they're exposed to sun. I don't know why, witchcraft maybe. Sometimes they get lighter, but no matter what, like 99.9% of the time, if they get too much sunlight, the color will change of the spine, and that affects the value of your book, and that just, it doesn't make it look as pretty. And when you have an antique book, you want it to look pretty, because I mean, it's like, it's an antique book. You want to show this thing off. It's a really cool thing. One more thing that you do definitely want to keep track of when you're storing your antique books is make sure to have them like in your house. Don't put them in a box in your garage. There are a lot of reasons for that, but one of the big reasons is because you need to keep your books at a moderate, quote unquote, moderate temperature. And that is between, I have it written down here, between 65 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Preferably not Celsius, that'd be a little problematic. But you want to keep it at around that range. Of course, you can fudge the numbers a little bit. For me, I have the books in my house, and my house does not stay that temperature whatsoever. I live in Oregon, so in the winter, my inside of my house gets down in the 50s, and then in summer, it goes who knows where because it gets so toasty sometimes. And yeah, I could spend a fortune to keep the house heated and cooled, but I'm not doing that, so my books are not getting stored as well as they should be. And I know I said the whole thing about I want my books to be as good a condition as possible, and I know that is an issue for me. So I do have it down in a room that is a little more climate controlled and does maintain a more steady temperature. But of course, I am not keeping it the exact moderate temperature that it says it should be. So that is something else that you guys do want to keep in mind, is make sure that your house doesn't get too cold and too hot. Between what that does to the binding itself, and also when you get the big temperature differences, it also does stuff with moisture. So make sure you're doing something that stays as close to the moderate level as you can to make sure your books last as long as possible. And back to what I was saying about garage. So there are probably 1,000,005 reasons why you should not store your antique books in your garage. One of them, a big one, is because moisture. Let's be honest, guys, no matter what we do, there's always somehow going to be a leak and a spill in your garage. I don't know why. That's just how it always sort of happens. For me, I actually have an interesting story. I had some people I knew who had their water heater in their garage, and their water heater exploded one day and just drenched everything. That was absolute mess. So if you had your antique books there, all your antique books could very well be destroyed. And talking about water destroying books, let's just think about the movie The Incredibles. Remember when their fire sprinklers went off and got all their books wet? That's another thing you want to be careful with your antique books or any of your books in general. Be sure that if there is ever a leak in your house, or if you have water sprinklers, make sure they don't spray your books. You don't want your books getting wet. I know that's pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised how many antique books I get. Like literally thousands of antique books that I've gotten. And you'd be surprised how many have water damage, like severe water damage. And it's like heartbreaking to see how much water damage some of them have. So be sure to store them in somewhere that it's not going to get wet. Something else though about putting your books in your garage is they're not as secure. Someone could break into your garage a lot more easy than breaking into your house for a lot of times. Another thing is pests. For some reason, I don't know why, a lot more mice and whatnot get into garages than your actual house, probably just because of how sealed off your house is as opposed to your garage. But that's another thing that you want to consider. If you keep an animal in your garage, like a cat or whatever as well, you don't want all the pet fur getting onto the books, because getting pet fur onto books really, trust me guys, it affects the value of your books in such a big way. A lot of people, a lot more than you think, believe it or not, are allergic to animals. They do not want animal fur on their books, because then every single time they open it, they'll be sneezing, they'll be crying, all that sort of stuff. So that's something you definitely want to keep in mind. And also don't let your cat like sleep on top of your book. If you see your cat doing that, maybe you should like put it in a wood chipper. I don't know. I'm kidding there. Don't actually murder an animal. It's sort of not nice. I mean, if you have to, make sure it's a cat and not a dog, because dogs are better. That's a joke. Don't shoot me. But definitely be sure that you aren't storing your books next to animals, because that does affect the value. And I've had friends that have dogs chew up their books. I've also had friends that have cats pee on their books. I think I'd rather have a chewed up book than a cat pee book, because cat pee is absolutely terrible, and dogs are just better in general. So I don't know. Sorry, another dog joke. But all that said and done, guys, there are 1,000 ways that you are supposed to store your antique books. I'm not saying you need to do it exactly how a museum does it. Doing it like a museum will make it so the book lasts longer, but let's be honest, guys, it is not quite as convenient to do it like that. So there are some things that you can fudge on and you cannot do quite perfectly, but there is a lot of stuff that you guys really do need to focus on when you are hanging on to your books, especially if you're trying to or planning on reselling them anywhere in the future. Even if you aren't planning on doing it, but your like great-great-grandson might do it. That's something you definitely want to keep in mind. You don't want to make it so these books aren't worth anything. And on top of that, you don't want to let the books get too destroyed. Like, yeah, they're going to wear out with age, but don't let them get totally destroyed. And something else, let's be honest, I know this is a bit of a pro tip, extra thing, but remember what I said about how I don't like to read my antique books? I know it stinks. I know it would be really cool to read all your antique books. But guys, maybe it'd be better to buy a new version of the book. So there are a lot of antique books out there that they still are printing the books because they were popular. It might be worth buying that book in a new version to read it if you really want to read it, because otherwise you're wearing out the book. And I know you guys bought these books to read sometimes, but that's not always the best way to make sure the book lasts. Like, yes, you can read it. It's your book. It's your property. I don't really, I personally care a little bit, but, let's be honest, it's your life. You can choose to do whatever you want to do. This is America, and yeah, but if you want to make your books last, maybe you should buy a new one. Let's be honest. Keep your antique book, because it's really stinking cool, but read a new one. It's just something that you really should do, because the books do wear out so easily and they break all the time. You can pop pages loose if you don't handle them right. And if, say your kids see you reading them all the time, they'll want to read them all the time, and that'll just ruin the book in the long run. So all that said and done, once again, for the closing things, be sure to store your books correctly, guys. This list that I told you guys is not an exhaustive list. There are a lot of other things that you should do. These are just the big things that I highly recommend you do, but there are, again, other things. So be sure to Google it. Be sure to check out 10 different sites, not just one site, and find out exactly what they recommend. Decide what things you can take. Decide what things just sound weird and aren't worth doing. You need to put together sort of what you want to do personally. And I mean, if you really want to go all out, you can call up a professional and be like, hey, how do I store an antique book? And they might give you a better answer than what this whole video is. But I think this video really does give you really good tips, a lot of ones that you might not actually think of on your own. And I hope that it really helps you guys store your antique books better. And if you are selling antique books like me, I hope it has it so your store actually does better because your books are in better condition. And with that said, if you want to resell antique books, or if you even want to buy more antique books, I talk about that a lot in my channel. So be sure to subscribe below, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.